brothers and sisters, my friends, my neighbors. On this a wet morning for the third Sunday of Easter, a soggy morning in April, which is not, in spite of what the poet may have said, not the cruelest month. Here now a line from the scripture according to Luke chapter 24, verses 28 through 32. The longer lection is in the bulletin for those of you who may have it. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening, and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" Let's call this one Walking to Emmaus. I am about to lose it. I have had it and I just can't take anymore. 3 days ago, or was it 3 days? Maybe it's 4 now. Our commander-in-chief suggested we might ingest disinfectant to combat the coronavirus. What in heaven's name is he thinking? The governor of Georgia decides to reopen the state to ward off the economic slide toward disaster in spite of the terrible escalation in the number of infections and deaths his citizens must endure. What is he thinking? The mayor of the city of Las Vegas wants to open up casinos without a shred of a plan to protect the witless patrons who would dare to indulge themselves with losses at the one-armed bandits, not to mention the more horrendous loss of life they may incur. What can she be thinking? Armed militants, I use the word loosely, stand on Capitol steps insisting upon their rights to work, to play, and to come and go as they please, amid the invisible killer they spread indiscriminately when folk gather to work, to play, and to come and go as they please. One wonders what good the guns might do against an invisible airborne enemy. What are these protesters thinking? One begins to wonder if anyone at all is still thinking. The doctors, the nurses, healthcare professionals, for their part, are aghast and embarrassed by the nonsense they have heard from our highest officials, and they are terrified that others may follow deadly prescriptions for cleansing themselves of COVID-19 with Lysol. I tell you, I had to turn off the television. I had to silence the radio and put down the cell phone. I have had enough. So I decided to take a walk to Emmaus to consider along the way what all of this absurd chaos could possibly mean, if chaos could mean anything. The stink of death clings to the air, and everyone knows someone who has now since succumbed to the virulent, silent killer. So I took my walk to Emmaus, back and forth along the stretch of my front yard to mow the grass. This is as therapeutic an act as ever I have found when I am greatly stressed. Just mow the grass, Edward. Just go out and mow the grass. It's simple, it's steady, it's achievable, it's not without purpose, and it's calming all at once. It realigns my nerves, it exercises my muscles, and it does clear my head. Say, maybe I could come mow your grass. Just as I had made several passes, my neighbor approached from across the street, masked and cheerful. Even though she wore the mask, I could still see how cheerful she was. I have long since become accustomed to her being that way. I turned off the mower, and from a safe distance I greeted her with an exchange of the familiar inquiry that we hear so very often these days. How are you and your folks doing? I am blessed that on our street I should have such neighbors as this modern day Martha, because she soon made me aware that if I or anyone in my family needed masks, she was occupying herself with making a few. So I welcomed the offer. Of course I did. And I am so grateful that I shall before long have what care and love alone may produce against the chaos of these times. At least it's one measure. I welcome it from her. I returned to my work with gusto and with a lighter step all along the way as I basked in the graciousness of my neighbor Martha. I thought of the Martha who waited on Jesus and who by custom and by habit had waited on any who had ever entered her home. And I thought to myself as my nose burned with sentiment, Martha's not dead. Martha is alive and lives across the street. Wow, Martha is my neighbor. As I made 2 or 3 more passes, I saw yet another neighbor from farther down my road who had come out for his daily stroll. He was the neighbor who several years ago had purchased a property that had been left vacant because the previous owner had passed away after a long life. I had not yet met our new neighbor, but I had heard from others about him and his wife, how genial and pleasant they were. We'd always seemed to just miss each other during the time of year when our cul-de-sac exchanged gifts for Christmas or during housewarmings and other occasions when our neighbors would mingle. When I saw him, I stopped the mower once more. This was my opportunity. At long last, I thought to myself, to say hello and to extend my welcome, however belated. He smiled, I smiled, both of us, to signify that we knew we had taken too long to do what was in order. So we engaged each other in a long greeting to share stories about ourselves, our origins, our work, and even our hopes for what might come next out of the midnight of our struggles with COVID-19. Suddenly, our conversation turned to the previous owner of my new neighbor's home. He had not known him, and I, for my part, had not known him well. He had heard stories about him, and I had too. So we shared our stories, and on this one point, our stories agreed. He had been, how shall I say it, irascible. Yeah, I'm afraid it's true. There we were, sharing our stories about the dead, and in this instance, our stories were not altogether flattering. When first I had arrived where I now live, my other neighbor on the other side of me, closer to the main drag, shared stories about the time when she and her husband had first decided to purchase the empty lot where their house now stands. She told me when Mr. Irascible heard about their intention to build, he had objected to the city authorities that they should not be permitted to do so. She and her husband, a dentist in town, and perhaps, indeed I'm quite sure, he was the only black dentist at that time in town, had been convinced that Mr. Irascible's objection had little to do with the good doctor's occupation. As I shared the story, my neighbor and I grimaced with the fatigue that accompanies all our sorry tales of racism. Nonetheless, I assured my neighbor that despite what either of us had heard about the old fellow, that was not the end of the story. When my grandchildren were very young, I would take them with me to deliver Christmas gifts to the neighbors along our street. Marcus and Victoria loved to accompany me just to see how our gifts would be received. For who does not delight in receiving gifts? Who does not relish the joy and the power to give one? The first year we went to Mr. Irascible's house, I remember he greeted us at the door. not with a scowl, but more of a look of curiosity about what we might want. And when he saw that we wanted just to give him a gift, his whole face opened. It opened up, and he eagerly pointed us to a standing Santa Claus there beside his door, about as tall as my grandchildren. He said to them with a twinkle in his eye, "Watch this." He tripped a switch, and then the Santa Claus began to wiggle, to jiggle, and to sing. "Here comes Santa Claus, here comes Santa Claus, right down Santa Claus Lane." Oh no, that we lived on Santa Claus Lane, I thought to myself as I laughed from within. My Marcus and Victoria squealed with delight to see that dancing, singing Santa, and Mr. Irascible seemed to me transfigured with glee. I still recall, as I remembered it for my neighbor, how Mr. Irascible had sent to us each holiday season as his Christmas token a large blooming poinsettia, gorgeous. Indeed, poinsettias in all their glory would arrive every Christmas until he was called to glory. So far as I know, every neighbor on the street received this beautiful offering. My neighbor, the present owner, was pleased to hear that tale because it was not what he had most often heard. But I told him there was still more to the tale. There was the more to the tale for which I am myself the witness. After a long decline in his health, my dentist neighbor near the main drag passed away. I attended the funeral and was moved to see Mr. Irascible in attendance as well. There he was, sitting in the pew with tears welling in his eyes. I had seen him laugh with my grandchildren, and now he was crying over the loss of his neighbor at the other end of the street. He shared his condolence with the widow and confided with her that her husband had been one of the finest gentlemen he had ever known. This was the same man who had objected to the intention of the deceased to build a home for his wife on a road named for an orchard. What strange fruit! Oh, but how very delicious. I told my new neighbor this was more a story of redemption as I had ever witnessed. I saw for myself how Mr. Irascible, following the death of the dentist, had paid to repair the walkway to the widow's front door after it had begun to crumble. How he had paid to pave her driveway when the grass peeped through. He did it. Out of an act of sheer generosity, he did it. I don't pretend to know all the reasons why. It is sufficient for me to know that as I walked to Emmaus, my neighbors walked with me for a while. And as I pondered the chaos of disease, stupidity, and ignorance, my neighbors showed me grace, care, and the lifeline of stories of the dead, redeemed through love and care. My heart burned within me to share our worries and our hopes for a grace so rare and yet so near. Christ is alive among us in the breaking of bread, and the bread is sometimes our greeting one another with a "how are you?" and a life-saving offer of face masks. Sometimes the scent of broken bread can be savored in the sharing of stories about broken lives, mended by acts of kindness. Sometimes Christ is with us in the simplest acts and not in the cloudburst or the flare of firecrackers. Sometimes all it takes is the hum of a lawnmower and fresh cut rows of grass to summon the quiet ripple of resurrection. Are you sure you don't need me to cut your grass? Oh, look, here comes another neighbor. Let's take that long walk to Emmaus together. If you tell me your story, I'll tell you mine. Tell me, do you recognize Jesus now? Amen.